So today I want to talk about this gap between the emerging technologies and the tools that organizations are trying to put into place and the data and the data infrastructure. I wrote an article for Harvard Business Review that coincided with the date of my book launch, which was just last month. And it was about whether your data infrastructure was ready for AI. And a lot of organizations are finding that's not the case. So what we need to do is be sure that the core data infrastructure is adaptable and agile and can handle these types of emerging technologies as well as your legacy systems. Mary D mentioned the book. It's just been released, so you can purchase it on Amazon. And it had a lot of good feedback from folks like Tom Davenport, who said, I don't know any books that have such useful and detailed advice about the relationship between data and successful AI systems. But there's much more than that, because much of what you'll find is that the foundation for all of this stuff has to be in place no matter what you're doing, whether it's conversational AI or predictive analytics or any other type of machine learning, and got some other good feedback from other folks. So anyway, buy the book. There's some really good stuff in there. So I'd like to talk about a couple of takeaways for today. Everybody realizes that data is the critical ingredient for anything that we're trying to do. Our world is made of data. Our magical devices, as I like to call my iPhone, is made of sand, metal, and oil, all very cleverly arranged. In other words, a lot of data and a lot of content and a lot of knowledge. But the problem is that we have these ongoing, seemingly intractable problems around building these capabilities because of the lack of availability of the data. Many times things will work in a proof of concept or a sandbox or a pilot. Then when we try to move them to production, the data infrastructure is very different. We don't have the ability to operationalize things. We can put a lot of energy into preparing data for a pilot or a sandbox, but then when we try to get it out into our operations, there are lots of challenges. Now, leadership in the organization has been aware of this. They have been dealing with these problems, and they've been dealing with lots of efforts over the years. And what has happened? We still have the problems. We don't seem to address them in a sustainable way that is cost effective. So you have a lot of reluctance on the part of the business and the part of the organization to make the needed investments. And there's a number of reasons for that, because many times this type of work has to be done at a very foundational level. It's difficult to show the ROI when you're cleaning data or when you're structuring data or when you're building out data flows or workflows or onboarding processes. Everybody wants to know, how's this going to improve, revenue or reduce costs? And there's no direct correlation between the thing that you need to do to prepare and the thing that you need that preparation for. I interviewed a chief data officer for a bank some time ago, and one of the things she said was she went into the job and said to the board, look, we can fix these data problems that we have. They're vast, they're endemic, they're entrenched in the organization. However, it's going to take 3 to 5 years, and it's going to cost $75 to $100 million. And don't ask for an ROI because you're not getting one. Now that takes a lot of chutzpah, right? To be able to go into the board and say that. Now, she made some progress, but ultimately, when you have that type of long-term initiative that has a later payoff, that's a lot of work, it's a lot of effort, it takes people off of other things they may perceive to be more important. If we can't demonstrate how that's meeting their short and long-term needs, it's going to be very difficult to get that support. We can't show that clear ROI. So I'm going to give you some approaches for looking at this a little differently so that you can get that support. And what we have found is if we can somehow link what we're doing to some aspect of the customer experience or a process, department, or function that supports that customer experience, we can drive multiple data initiatives. We can get a lot of other things done by setting this up as an improvement to the customer experience. Many times, though, we find that if a digital agency is in charge of customer experience, they don't necessarily want to deal with the data. So we have to be very careful about how we design these programs so that we're not just waving our arms talking about the data or assuming that the data is ready or saying, oh, that's the IT problem, or we'll deal with it later, but really thinking about that from the start as a foundation for these measurable improvements to aspects of the customer experience. Now, when we can retain buy-in and we can retain participation and support and funding, if we can show that progress, and if we can show the value to the individual, the stakeholder, the owner, the process person responsible for that process, we can do that if we show it's important to them. If it's important to somebody upstream or downstream and not to them, it doesn't matter. So this is really important to show these chains of responsibility and ways that the data will support processes, the processes will support a business outcomes, the business outcomes will support the organizational strategy. So there are really a lot of new demands on enterprise data capabilities. The business has unending needs, and those needs change all the time, and they look to technology in the IT organization to solve those problems or provide the results that they need. And there's a lot of new technologies and a lot of emerging technologies that have an even greater dependence and a greater focus. And of course, our legacy systems are messy many times because we haven't focused on data governance or had consistent guiding principles and processes for those initiatives. And one of the things I want to say is, people are saying, well, wait a minute, we can use AI for that. We can bring AI in. It's going to fix our data. It's going to address these issues. And no, AI cannot make up for your past sins in poor data hygiene. It can help, but it cannot obviate the need for doing some of this fundamental work. So there's a lot of different ways to look at these strategies that are at a high level to say, what are we trying to do? When we say we want to improve customer experience, or we want to have greater levels of customer intelligence, it's to support something that is going to have a business outcome. And there are lots of measures. So this was from one client who is investing in these different areas. And then they were looking at, well, what are the technologies that will support this? And what can we begin to measure? And again, these measurements are high-level measurements. There'll be a lot of other contributory factors and other sub-metrics that will contribute to this. But these are examples of things that are important that are going to fit in with the strategy that we need to measure, not only a current state, but the future state. We have to have a baseline. So when we look at this problem of data quality and availability, this came from Juan Cicada, who is with Data.World, and he's actually doing a webinar with us next week on knowledge graphs and graph data. And this is the problem, right? There's so many complexities. There's so many data sources. There's a lot of nobody knows where all the bodies are buried, right? There's no documentation. We don't understand the relationships. There's too many data tables and attributes and inconsistencies. We don't necessarily know who the experts are. We don't necessarily know how to interpret naming conventions because they can be very esoteric and purpose-built for a specific application. So this is a big problem, and trying to map these things together is very different. What's the implication? All the stuff that you hear about. It's unnecessary friction through the process. When we are trying to get data to do something, either onboard it or analyze it, when we don't understand it, it's going to slow us down. The transformations are inefficient. There's no one who has that full overarching holistic understanding, especially in a large enterprise, of those complexities and the details of where the data comes from and where it goes and how it's used. And again, what happens is it reduces the ability for the organization to adapt, to react, to be agile, to take advantage of opportunities in the marketplace, to respond to customer needs, to respond to competitive threats. And what's happening is IT organizations are really being crushed by this unsustainable level of overhead, which is just to keep the lights on rather than to truly innovate. So this is a major problem, and organizations have to deal with this in a meaningful way. But if it's so important, why is leadership reluctant to make the investments? And it's a very simple reason. It's because they've been burned. There's been lots of costly efforts, costly failures, and the inability to address it at the root. So there's a number of things that have to happen here, but we have to start with a business case and a business value that people will understand. Because what's funny is I sat down with some folks at a data summit a number of years ago. I sat down with a person who worked in a data department and was a data steward, and I met with these two data geeks and their boss, and for I think it was 2 hours they were explaining to me what they were doing. And I have some knowledge in this space. I have some savvy. I have some fluency, and I kept asking questions about who they were serving, what the business process was, what the value was. I could not understand what they were doing. I could not understand what they were trying to accomplish, who their customer was, what business value. I could not. And that was after me asking probing question after probing question after probing question. 2 hours later, I couldn't understand it. I didn't know what they were doing. If I have that kind of trouble interpreting what they're doing, certainly the business, the organization is going to have a lot of trouble comprehending that, understanding it, seeing the value, and then saying, okay, that's worth putting our energy into. So we really have to think of this differently. And if we look at the customer experience, that is one of the things that we can measure. We can measure many, many different aspects of this. And if we can focus our data efforts on particular stages of the customer experience, we can actually solve lots of different problems. We can measure the result, but we can apply the outcome to many different types of data initiatives. So here's how you have to think about it. We have to ground these programs so that we can start to say, here's the impact on our revenue. Here's the impact on our customer. Here's the impact on the experience. And this is just taking one example. It leverages product data and the customer on-site experience, but we need to make sure people understand what we're trying to do, that it's measurable, that it's linked to a very specific outcome, a business outcome. And what's happening is, we're getting signals from lots of different systems. There's another slide I'm going to show you that talks about these different sources, and it's data exhaust. The data that comes out of one system is used for another system, is used for an input. And there's lots of signals in that data exhaust. And there's lots of noise in that data exhaust. So what we need to do is figure out what are those signals and what are they telling us? What are they indicating? How do we make a decision? How do we do remediation? And there's a bunch of ideas here. You can have, something where, well, people are coming to the website and then they're leaving, they're bouncing out. They're not buying our products. They're not even investigating the products. They're not registering. So what does that mean? It means that there's a number of possibilities. Either the path wasn't clear, the user was in the wrong place, they didn't understand the content, it didn't meet their needs. The navigation was misleading, you didn't get the right results, etc. There's lots of different contributory factors here. And what we can do is we can start to separate that out, and we can start to say, well, what do we actually need from this? Because, there's no shortage of metrics, right? There's hundreds, thousands of dashboards. All of these systems are kicking off information. So how do we get to the signal that's important to us? And again, this is the problem that people are trying to solve. They're saying, all right, well, you're going to do this data initiative, this data project. Well, how's it going to increase revenue? But if you're down in the weeds and you're working with, modeling product content, or you're standing up a CRM, or you're trying to improve search, well, that's not directly going to show value, business value. That's not going to lead to increased revenue. So when you're in the weeds, it's hard to do that. But You can show scorecards of how you're working, how things are progressing. You can show data scorecards and quality scorecards. Now, the data and the content support a process. What are those processes that we're trying to enable? Those processes can be measured, and we can have process scorecards that tell us how well the data is supporting a process. Then, of course, the process is not, giving us revenue right away. It's leading to another objective. It's in support of something that's bigger. You have multiple processes around customer acquisition, and then we have an outcome. And the outcome is the thing that I like to say people are either bonused on or these metrics drive a resume generating event, right? So they get bonused or fired at the outcome level. That's what's important to people. And then, of course, the objectives align with the strategy, and you need to have that linkage. Now, if you've been to my webinars, you've probably seen this slide before, but believe me, there's a lot to unpack in here. And with one industrial client, we've been working on this for 3 years. It takes a long time. It takes a while to get a handle on this. First, you have to have good data. Then you have to have the right processes. You have to have the right people at the table. You have to understand chains of trust when we're looking at processes and when we're trying to leverage our data in some way, shape, or form. But this is critical, and people don't necessarily intuitively understand the linkage. The linkage is what's critical. We have to show why this is going to enable these processes. We may think it's obvious, but it is not, right? So that's what we want to do. We want to do this to show that value. Now, what's your customer journey? Well, every industry has different variations on this. Insurance is discovery, awareness, consideration, purchase, retention, advocacy, telecom, learn, buy, get, use, pay, support, manufacturing, and even within a company in these industries, there may be differences, right? These are generic journeys, but your customer journey may be different. And if you're a diversified manufacturer or conglomerate, or you have lots of different customers, you're going to have lots of different journeys, and you have to build these out. Now, what we can do, though, is we can understand and recognize that in each journey step, there are people and processes responsible for that. So at the learn stage, marketing is trying to draw people in. So they want to use good search engine optimization. They want to make sure their keywords are there. They want to make sure that they can, get the right customers. They need to profile customers. They need to test. There's a lot of things. There's a lot of metrics around that whole process. Then what happens next? People have to make a choice. Well, what does that mean? We're going to optimize their search. We're going to optimize that user experience. We're going to see if there are disconnects once they get to the site. If they bounce away, we need to know that. So again, there are a whole range of metrics that can be defined for that stage. The same thing with purchase, the same thing with use, the same thing with maintain, recommend. There are internal accountabilities and internal departments that are responsible for each of these things. Marketing is usually responsible for learn. Sales is responsible for buy, distribute, forget, and so on. And then you have the processes that are supporting that, and then you have accountabilities. Now, how does the metrics fit in with this? We can start to look at this from a, well, this is kind of a bottom up over here, but we're saying, well, how is the data, what does the data look like? How is search working? If I'm looking at support or any of these things in this area, there are tools that are performing in a certain way, and we can measure the performance. We can measure the quality of the data. We can measure how well those systems are being used. We actually have a complete framework for evaluating your marketing technology stack and applying these measures. But then we can also say, well, what are those processes? So there are processes here that are in support of that customer experience, that journey. Those are also things that can be measured, right? That's the process efficiency. And then, of course, we're trying to say, well, what are the accountabilities and what are we trying to do? And that's really getting into the business outcomes. So it's kind of taking that metrics layer cake, turning it upside down, because we want to evaluate each of these, and then we can start to look at how this contributes to things like net promoter score or customer loyalty or or churn, or any of the things that are important that will be contributing factors to a successful strategic plan or execution. So again, this is what's critically important. We want to understand each of these scorecards and each of these levels of metrics, because that's how we can track our contribution to the outcome. That's how we can build the capability. But again, when there's too much of a disconnect and people don't see the value, we have to map it out. We have to make it explicit. Now, there's lots of nuances to this. There's lots of other issues. There's lots of things that have to happen. But basing things on metrics is critically important, because that is how we're going to start demonstrating ROI. And if you don't think you can demonstrate ROI, I guarantee you can if you deconstruct the process and start looking at the inputs and the outputs, right? So customer behavior, customer feedback, employee behavior, employee feedback, process performance, total cost to serve, product performance, and so on. There's lots of different things. These are the things that the executives want to understand, and our job is to get the data in shape so that we can do this analysis. And by tracking this and aligning this with either something that directly supports the customer or the person that supports the customer is really important. I'm briefly going to talk about ontologies and knowledge graphs and graph data, because that is the next generation of getting your data in order. An ontology, if you're not familiar with it, and by the way, that is what my book is about. It's about ontologies and how you leverage them. And again, not just about AI, but any initiative. There's a lot of blocking and tackling in here. The ontology really becomes its multiple taxonomies and thesaurus structures and all your organizing principles organized in a structure that allows you to overlay the understanding of things like how products go with services, how solutions go with problems, the relationships between risks and regions for an insurance company, or biochemical pathways and a mechanism of action for a life sciences firm. All of those different ways of describing the concepts become related to one another in the ontology. It's a combination of all the taxonomies and thesaurus structures and all the relationships between them. This isn't a session about ontology. We have one coming up next week, but they become the source of truth for the content and the data structures and relationships. It's different than MDM. MDM starts at a data layer. We're starting at a business concept layer, and then we can implement it in lots of different types of systems. It allows the organization to communicate across application. It allows artificial intelligence algorithms to understand your business, your terminology, what's important to you. A knowledge graph is something you may have heard about, and a knowledge graph really is the operationalization and execution of an ontology. It is a representation of your information domain. It's always evolving. It includes structured and unstructured types of models. It helps us operationalize ontology. It helps us reconcile inconsistencies. And really, they describe the structure. They link the structure to the data. The ontologies define the structure of a knowledge graph. A knowledge graph takes the data and puts it in that structure, essentially. And next week, on the 17th, we're going to have a webinar with data.world. So if you want to go to early.com, you can check that out. So when we want to start building out this architecture, this experience, the motherhood and apple pie of, improved efficiencies and contextualized experience and the right information, the right time for the right person, we really do have to have this North Star, this vision of an enterprise architecture that will leverage these terms and concepts consistently across the organization. This is aspirational. This is a North Star. Probably going to be hard to get there, but you can't have acts of heroics upstream where people can't find their stuff and have a seamless experience externally. And at the end of the day, it is about building that seamless customer experience, understanding that customer, getting them the right data and content in the right time, in the right format. We have to do that for internal users as well. So when you want to do this, you want to build, you want to get that buy-in and you want to keep it, and you have to do that by establishing those baselines, by understanding those problems and data sources, understanding the impact to your stakeholders. There's a lot of different prioritization approaches. We've covered those in other webinars, but you can get those conversations started when you start putting these into a framework to say, well, what's the business value and what do we need to do and how complex, et cetera. And we want to take those big picture vision objectives and translate them into very tangible goals that can be part of the business imperative and the departmental and process metrics. The vision of being, a data-driven organization or an AI-powered organization is great. We have to translate it into things we can do today. And then we also have to translate that message according to the different stakeholders and what they need and how they will use the data and the outcomes and how they will benefit. And at the end of the day, it really has to be developing these multiple levels of scorecards and dashboards, because it'll help you course correct, it'll show the value, you'll measure the ROI, you'll be able to fine tune and continually adjust these decisions that are made. And this goes into a metrics-driven governance playbook, which really helps you allocate resources for data initiatives. It helps you allocate resources for infrastructure, for technology, and it helps you understand that you are, in fact, getting the return on investment and the organization is on track while you're doing these projects, because it's going to take time to see some of the results. I just wanted to give you a few other reading lists and, of course, buy my book. And I don't know if we have time for questions.